After thoroughly discussing the government, let's talk about the gluten-free, cross-fitting, vegan, heroic, feministic, Kemalistic, democratic, pluralistic, pro-life heroes of the opposition. I will mainly focus on the CHP in this video because the election in Turkey can be broken down to the infighting between CHP and AKP. And I have to start this part of the video with a disclaimer as well, since some people might start watching this video first instead of the video about the government. I will use you or they, but I'm not referring to you in particular or all Kemalists. I'm referring to the people that are subject to my criticism and the people that support a specific side regardless of criticism. I'm sure there are enough decent people within the ranks of the CHP, but this is not about all CHP members anyways. So just bear with me when I say they or you as an example. And again, I might lack some explanations or sources or views, but you cannot expect of me that I have everything available and know about everything. Turkish media is already full of shit and people are eager to humiliate you, even if you genuinely want to know something, so it's already extremely hard as it is to get to new perspectives. So as mentioned in the previous video, if you have a different view about things I criticize, then just provide your source in the comments and we can discuss about this. And lastly, even though I'm going to be very harsh in this video is in no shape or form meant to discredit your personal choice for the opposition. Vote for them for all I care, but I believe it's more than necessary to speak about the concerning aspects of the opposition. Because as a matter of fact, people act like they're the divine heroic people of goodness that stand against pure evil that is supposed to be Erdogan, and we're meant to laud them for that. Plot twist, reality is not black and white. And before people pull the trigger, it's not like I think the opposition is just full of shit. There are obviously some things that are worth praising. For instance, I'm not a fan of the Gezi protests due to how they were conducted, but it brought international attention to various topics that were not working within the country. Even though this was not organized by the opposition, this was however led by the opposition voters. There are also various examples of corruption scandals which become a public discussion that would otherwise just fall into darkness. Like the corruption scandal involving the Halkbank executive and high-ranking people within or close to the AKP government, or the lack of transparency with the 128 billion USD that were, according to the government, burned down to stabilize the currency. It's also worth mentioning and praising that Kemal brought Kemalists and conservatives closer to each other by forming a grand coalition with former AKP members. Even though this is not the best development, it's nice to see that people are getting at least a bit closer. It's also worth mentioning that certain provinces led by the opposition performed quite marvelous in terms of economic development. However, these things are far and wide apart from each other, which is why I'm not going to mention much about the things they are doing fine here. I'm sure there is much more, but it's much more subject to subjective criteria than objective ones, excluding the development of various provinces under the CHP, which also happened under other parties. So let's get started with an obvious issue first, the lack of substance. Since the last time the CHP was in charge was more than 4 decades ago, it's really hard to compare the possible leadership of the opposition with the government. After all, you can just shit talk from the position of opposition the government all day long and claim that you could have done a better job without providing any valid reasons to how you would have done a better job and without hindsight. However, this does not mean that there is nothing to criticize. I'm going to stick to the last roughly 13 years of the opposition with my criticism, since the leading figure Kemal Kilicdaroglu is in charge since then. And we have to start this with the track record of failure of Kemal Kilicdaroglu. So I don't really want to spend too much time on this, but if you just check parliamentary/general elections so far, you see that the opposition went from roughly 26% to roughly 25% to roughly 22%. So since Kemal Kilicdaroglu is in charge, the CHP is losing more and more relevancy, and this is despite the case that they pride themselves to get more young educated voters. So something doesn't really add up. And some might come and say that according to recent polls, the CHP was up to roughly 30%, and yes, that is a fact, but it is also a fact that Turkey hit rock bottom before that was even possible. So the 30% are not what the CHP would normally get, but a reaction to the abysmal times the government put the Turkish people through, which is why it's delusional to credit Kemal to this increase in votes. The increase of about 5 to 10% are frustrated voters, and here's the thing, as the main opposition parties, even in the worst case scenario, this party only amounts to roughly 30% of the votes, which tells us a lot about how disliked the CHP leadership actually is. However, instead of changing the leadership, Kemal loves his seat too much to make room for someone new. And the ironic part of all of this is that the opposition loves to label Erdogan as a dictator. Alright, then what is Kemal? He is as power hungry as Erdogan, or how do you explain that he can stay in charge of the party despite the track record of failures? This is not possible in any proper democracy, which is why it's valid to say that Kemal in particular is not interested about Turkey or the Turkish people, but about his own personal glory. This also shows the lack of backbone across the CHP, which is why everyone is fine with this. The only person that had the necessary backbone was Ince, who left the party. This becomes apparent when we consider the fact that in the upcoming election, İmamoğlu and Yavaş got degraded to cheerleaders instead of opposition candidates. İmamoğlu and Yavaş were both consistently ahead of Erdogan in polls, especially Yavaş going up to 60 to 65% of the votes in polls. However, instead of putting them as the main opposition candidate, Kemal rather gambled for his own glory and put himself as the candidate. He has the lowest rating among the three people, so he doesn't give a flying F about the wishes of his own people, he wants himself to be at the spotlight. And to make matters into a complete circus, Yavaş and İmamoğlu were announced as vice presidents. Now, even though this is according to Turkish law legal, you cannot disregard the obvious conflict of interests of being a mayor of a province and vice president at the same time. But it gets worse and more of a complete circus. Kemal didn't just announce the abuse of the law here, he announced that he is legally going to steal taxpayer money for Yavaş and İmamoğlu. Because if they become vice presidents, the next regional election is going to be in a year, and for that time period, these people have two positions at once, getting paid for two jobs while doing only one. Not that the vice president has much to do in the first place, but Kemal is literally telling everyone, we're going to steal your tax money for Yavaş and İmamoğlu, and we're supposed to celebrate them for this. This is also the reason why I have my issues with Yavaş and İmamoğlu, because both of them also lack the backbone to protest the stupidity. They are fine being partners in crime. This gets even worse when we consider the fact that even though appointing two vice presidents is legal, it's still an abuse of power within the presidential system, and also criticized by the Venice Commission. So we have personal greed, legalized theft, and abuse of power on the list, publicly announced, but hey, the government voters are the sheeps. In what way is the CHP now better than the government in terms of balance of power and greed and abuse again? Because I fail to see it here. But this topic gets even funnier. Back in the June 2015 election, the government failed to get 50% of the votes in order to form a government, which is why the opposition had one shot to form a coalition themselves. MHP, CHP, and HDP were all in the parliament and could have formed a coalition. They failed, hence re-elections happened. Not that the nationalistic, Kemalistic, and separatistic party would have made much sense, but here's the important part. The MHP was until then a die-hard opposition party with Bahçeli in charge. They, Bahçeli and Erdogan, would publicly shit-talk each other up until this point. Not only did Kemal fail to get a die-hard opposition party into the same boat as him, he lost the MHP to the government, because after this election, the MHP and the AKP were best buddies forming coalitions for the upcoming elections. So Kemal actively pushed the nationalists away. Fast forward, he splits from the MHP because Bahçeli also loves the seat too much and doesn't care for his people or his nation and joins the opposition. Fast forward longer, he wants Yavaş as the candidate, Kemal puts himself as the candidate and pushes the nationalists yet again away. I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up forming a coalition with the government. Like, you can't make this shit up. How can you do the same stupidity and be fine with it? The 2015 election should have been the year where Kemal loses his job, but the CHP clearly lacks a backbone for change. And this part of the video might age like poor milk, but I'm going to say it anyways. The opposition is going to lose the upcoming election to Erdogan, get a complete mental breakdown, accuse Erdogan of manipulating the votes, and still keep being detached from reality. The votes are already swinging towards Erdogan's favor. So get effed for the next 5 years, because Kemal wanted to gamble for his greed for fame, and neither he, nor Yavaş, nor İmamoğlu, or anyone else in the grand coalition of the 6 circuses had enough backbone to protest the stupidity. He complained but didn't really do anything. Great. And it's not like this track record of failure or greed and attention hoeing was unknown by the CHP leadership. This is not a recent development. The 2010 referendum was, for example, highly hailed in the West as steps towards democracy and EU membership. It included social, economic, military and judicial reforms, so there shouldn't be any reason to oppose it, since this was an attack against the 1980 implemented constitution by the military junta. However, for some reason, incomprehensible to the mortal mind, the CHP was against it. Now granted, the criticism of the opposition was not entirely without base. The main criticism was that the judicative would be controlled by the government, no further explanations given, but I trust the Venice Commission in this regards more than the opposition. I also already mentioned the debacle back in the 2015 election, and one perfect example for attention hoeing is the march back in 2017 from Ankara to Istanbul led by Kemal himself. Officially, I have no idea what this was about, something about losing democracy, but this is a clear reference to Gandhi, and a really bad one on top. Gandhi and his followers were not paid by the British Empire, they didn't have political immunity, the streets were not blocked for Gandhi and co, and neither were toilets or food or water provided by various organizations. This is like a parody of Gandhi. In conclusion, this served nothing more than wasting taxpayer money, which is very ironic considering that Turkey was already in an economic recession. We totally need more such parodies. The Turkish taxpayers don't mind. Sheer incompetence, deception and lies can also be seen at the recent earthquake. For instance, İmamoğlu promised that he would be able to make Istanbul earthquake safe within 5 years. After he got elected, he backpedaled and claimed he required 100 years.
İstanbul en çok korktuğu bu deprem sorunu siz göreve geldiğiniz takdirde ne kadar sürede çözülür? 5 yılda çözülür.
Yani hayalci kimse olamaz ama 5 yılda bu çok hızlı hareket edilip çözülebilecek düzeyde.
İstanbul 7'nin üstünde beklenen depreme hazırlıklı mı?
Hızlı hareket edersek İstanbul'un sorununu çözmek için bize 100 yıl lazım. Bir yılda ne yapacağım? Bir yılda ne yapabilirim? Yani ya da 3 yılda ne yapabilirim? 5 yılda ne yapabilirim?
And when the earthquake in Hatay happened, the opposition was fast to be outraged. So, if tomorrow an earthquake happens in Istanbul and some 90,000 buildings are at risk, in the worst case scenario up to 2 million buildings, then we complain about İmamoğlu, or are we going to project and whine how the government is at fault? I can guarantee you that the opposition is going to blame the government because they lack the backbone to be honest with this topic. The harsh reality is that this is not an issue that can be solved short term, because it requires an enormous amount of money Turkey simply doesn't have. Now granted, you could criticize the amnesty of dubious construction sites that are not earthquake safe, like this one for example. However, if you think 2 seconds more about this topic, then you realize very fast that the alternative to banning these construction sites is equal to making millions of your citizens homeless. I could go on and on about this topic, but the point is that the CHP is lying to their own citizen in order to smear the government, and it doesn't come to a surprise that the 2020 earthquake, which fully or partially damaged about 6% of Izmir, is entirely forgotten here. And mind you, the earthquake happened in a developed part of Turkey and roughly 60 kilometers away from the city, and it was just 1 and lower in magnitude. The right questions in these cases should have been, are our current laws sufficient enough to provide safe housing that can stand against multiple earthquakes? Which areas in Turkey have a threat to experience multiple earthquakes? Which areas in Turkey should withstand which amount of magnitude? How can the money crisis in regards to safe buildings be solved? Can subventions from reinforcing buildings be made a possible strategy to combat the lack of earthquake security in buildings? But no analysis needed, let's just shit talk while people are dying under rubble. Don't get me wrong, the government takes responsibility here, but blaming the enforcement of laws, which is something the executive is responsible for on the legislative, sounds very stupid to me. And I think there is a time and place for shit talking, which is after an analysis of the situation is done, issues found, solutions sought, and people rescued. No one is helped with if the only thing that comes from the opposition is, people dead, you bet. Like wow, what an insightful analysis. This is totally not an insult to my people's intellect. I want to effing know why all of this happened and if it can happen in other areas of Turkey and to what degree and what can be done to prevent it. Can you as a viewer for example say that if 2 earthquakes with a magnitude of 7 or above would happen directly under Izmir, that the vast majority of the city could withstand the earthquakes? I personally can't. It also doesn't help the cause of the opposition that Kemal is a senile old man who doesn't know what he's talking about. An accusation of pedophile rape turned into claiming that Kemalists brought pedophile rape to prisons. Yes, I'm not making this shit up, this is not deepfake either.
Şimdi siz bana dönüp diyorsunuz ki muhalefet yapıyor musunuz diye. Ben size söyleyeyim. Hapishanelerde küçük çocuklara tecavüzü kim çıkardı? Biz çıkardık.
To quote him, who brought rape to small children in prisons? Us. You also happen to see him in front of Kızılay complaining that Kızılay was not where he was. Kızılay is a risk organization which is meant to appear in crisis areas.
Bir tek Kızılay çadırı dahi yok.
He's also a very lovely cosplayer. He likes to cosplay as a Muslim to break character by start eating food before the ezan, which is obviously super hard to hear in Turkey. And no, I don't give a flying F about the religion or non-religion of this man, but when the opposition voters make such a fuss over religion in politics or get a mental breakdown over the Hagia Sophia turning into a mosque, then this type of shit should equally and vocally be criticized. But I digress. Maybe the conservative voters are really just stupid and the opposition is really this grand coalition of gluten-free, cross-fitting democracy lovers with brilliant ideas. This brings me to the values of the CHP. I'm not talking about what they officially claim, but what they factually do. So the country hit rock bottom. Corruption, nepotism, inflation, devaluation of the currency, the abuse of power, freedom of speech, and whatnot are all rampant. We have an uncontrolled wildfire in Turkey, burning the entire country down. The Grand Coalition formed, with CHP leading it. The Table of Six is formed in February 2022. It's been more than a year, so what are their plans? Drum rolls? Nothing. There's no plan at hand. They just jerk off to the idea that people are frustrated enough to give their votes to anything but Erdogan, and that's about it. Like, don't get me wrong, if you dig deep enough, you can find enough explanations to all of the things I'm making fun about right now. This article, for example, has a rough explanation of what the opposition wants to do. My problem is that their advertisement campaign is not about the constitution or the problems of Turkey or the Turkish people. It's about humiliation, insults, and narcissism. The focus of the CHP channel is about how much better Kemal is going to be, not about any promises. Facebook is not much better, it's basically a copy of the YouTube channel and vice versa. And just to give you one example, in case you might be wondering what these videos are about, not that anyone in the comments starts whining about that I deliberately hide anything, this video starts with how the government is driving the entire nation into the abyss. It's not about the discussion, conversation, about people or the nation. It's about pushing the idea that the other side is evil and that they fight evil. The rest of the video is not any better. It's a 60-minute long rant about how everything was made worse, pretending that Turkey was much better before the AKP. No, it wasn't. It was worse. Not that being less worse nowadays should be hailed, but it doesn't change the fact that the CHP is lying and deceiving their own people here. And granted, it's still more than what the government is doing for the simple reason that they also briefly advertised their small information books. But why am I supposed to be satisfied with the bare bone minimum? Like, explain to me what your plan is. Why am I supposed to only read about it in this day and age? Your social media presence is there for this effing reason. I don't care how much you jerk off to Kemal Kilicdaroglu. Tell me what you plan to change, what your promises are. I'm not going to sit and read through your 156 pages, and if you're going to be honest, neither are going to be the crushing majority of the Turkish citizen. I don't want to think about what you mean, I want it to be explained by you. I don't need everything either but a short summary. So, what is my problem? After all, they at least showed some information books where everything is mentioned, right? Let's ignore the fact that these books are only about the constitution itself and the change of certain paragraphs, of which I cannot judge the scope and validity of. For instance, they want to change the words fundamental rights and duties to fundamental rights and freedom, and honestly, I don't think this is going to make any effing difference. It just adds empty air to these 156 pages, and it would require a separate analysis, but I shouldn't be forced to do that in order to understand their plan. My problem is that problems are not being taken serious, that each side is lying, that each side is trying to deceive my people, and that each side spits on the intellect of my people, which is why no side attempts to go further than to give some superficial statements about what they're going to fix. Let's grab the economy example. It's nice and fancy that the central bank is going to be independent, but what are the thoughts on exports versus imports? Energy, renewable energy, imported energy. How do you even want to guarantee the independence of the central bank? What are your thoughts on foreign direct investments? Like Kemal threatened the current investors with expropriation in regards to the new channel. So, what are you going to do about current and new investors? What sectors do you intend to finance and support? What about the debt of the government? What about the defense industry? Are we going to get comments on these things? Babacan used to be an AKP economic minister in the early 2000s. So was the economic development back then good, so that he's being put in charge of the economy in the case of a victory now? Well, let's grab the constitution example. It's nice and fancy that he wants to return to the parliamentary system, but how? Like, is the CHP going to force it down to the people or make a referendum again? How about the Istanbul Convention? Or corruption and nepotism? What about the rights of the minorities? Is there anything planned? How is the CHP going to enforce a balance of freedom of speech with respect to channels like Ahaber? Well, let's go to foreign policy. What's their stance to the Arabic neighbors? They claim that they want to send the refugees back. How? What's the plan? To which areas? What about the Islamists under Turkish protection in Syria? What are their plans with Armenia, Cyprus, Libya, Africa in general? They love to criticize the government with respect to the Uyghurs in China. Are they going to boycott China? How? Are they going to whine about China while allowing the same violation with Israel? They whine about the government's passive stance with respect to Greece and Greece apparently invading Turkish islands. Is the opposition going to invade Greece? How are they going to solve the EEZ dispute? Well, let's go to education. What are they going to fix? How are they going to fix it? What are they going to change? Well, let's go to postmodern culture. Are the taxes going to stay high? Which taxes are they going to change? What about loot boxes? Does Kemal even know what that is? Like, I could go on and on and on and on with my questions, and sure, if you dig deep enough, you might find answers to some of these questions, but I shouldn't be asking myself these questions in the first place. The answer to these questions should be advertised by the opposition, and this part of the video might come off quite chaotic, but it perfectly represents the state of the opposition. Chaos, lack of consistency, lack of plan, lack of reassurance. They're just whining, complaining, and jerking off to themselves. We are Kemalists. Sure, then start acting like one and stop bringing shame to Atatürk. It's because of people like Kemal Kilicdaroglu or because of the lack of backbone of the likes of Yavaş or İmamoğlu that Kemalism is dying out in Turkey.